This is LBC with Andrew Pearce.
We'll carry on with your calls, but very important story here. This was on the wires earlier. Ukraine's Nuclear Energy Regulatory Agency says that higher than usual gamma radiation levels have been detected in the area near the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear plant, which has been seized by the Russian military. The State Nuclear Regulatory Inspectorate said the higher levels have been detected, but didn't provide details of the increase. It's attributed to the rise to a disturbance of the topsoil due to the movement of a large amount of heavy military equipment through the exclusion zone and the release of contaminated radioactive dust into the air. What does this all mean? Let's talk to Mike Wood, Professor Mike Wood, who's chairing applied ecology at the University of Salford, who specialises in radioecology and studies the effect of radiation on the wildlife of Chernobyl. Professor, good evening to you.
Good evening, Andrew.
So when I heard that the Russians had got Chernobyl, I thought, blimey, that's worrying. I wasn't quite sure why. Now I think I know why, because already the radiation levels have gone up. Is that why we should all be worried?
Well, I mean, I'm, as you said at the start, I work on the wildlife of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. For me, a significant concern is the amount of disturbance to that environment which is taking place as a result of the Russians coming through there. The rise that you see in radiation levels around the power plant is actually a relatively minimal spike. Yes, it's a spike. You will see it being reported in nanosieverts per hour. Now, this is a scary sounding unit and it allows you to report things in the thousands. In reality, that's a bit like reporting the distance between Chernobyl and Kiev in meters. It's using a unit value, which makes it sound much higher than it actually is. What we're really talking about is something which we would normally report in a different unit, which is microsieverts.
Right.
The rise is about 20 times higher than normal. Frankly, it's about 16 times the rate of radiation that you measure on the aeroplane when you're flying from the UK through to Ukraine. So this is not an alarmingly high level of radiation that we're seeing at all. It's actually less than the spike that we see from the regular wildfire events that take place in the zone every year.
Why do you think, and you're a scientist, you're not a military strategist, but why do you think it was so important to the Russians that they got this? They got Chernobyl, because there was a very fierce fight over it, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear some of the stories that are coming from either side as to why, why is it so important to capture this area? In the one sense, this is an area where, there's concern of the fragility, if you like, of things like the new safe confinement, that big arch that's built over the reactor. If it was to be significantly damaged, then of course there could be further release of contamination from that. So strategically in a conflict situation, it'd be important to make sure that that was secure anyway. But actually from the perspective of the Russians, if you're trying to get through from Belarus into Ukraine, the passage through the exclusion zone is probably one of the most direct routes that you could take to get through and head down towards Kiev. So you can see strategically from that perspective as well, it almost forms a gateway into Ukraine for them. So as you say, I'm a scientist, I'm not a military strategist, but they would seem to be the two things that are likely to be on the minds of somebody that's planning how to get troops through towards Kiev.
If I'm just speculating here, if a bomb had gone off and landed right in the middle of the old site plant, how damaging would that have been to the environment, to the atmosphere? What could it have released?
Well, I mean, in reality, it would depend on where that bomb was to go off, how much damage it created to the confinement structures that are in place. Ultimately, those confinement structures are there to help with the decommissioning process of the site and the safe removal of radioactive material. If you were to get some sort of major explosion taking place, then of course you would expect there would be a release of radioactivity. I don't think anybody could say for definite how much of a release would occur. If the fighting has now moved beyond that area, then hopefully we're seeing a more stable situation as such in and around the reactor itself. All we can do is wait and see now what happens in terms of the zone long term and the sort of the activity around the zone into the future. I've been speaking with many of my colleagues from the Biosphere Reserve who manage the wildlife areas in the zone. They had to evacuate in advance of the Russian troops coming through. And, you know, they obviously have concerns about the wildlife, the biodiversity there, as well as obviously for their own safety now.
How long is it going to take to decommission this site, Professor?
Well, the decommissioning process is a long process. It's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And, you know, part of the decommissioning is about dismantling and removing waste from the old reactor building. Part of it is about just the long-term custodianship and maintenance of that site. There are many areas of the exclusion zone which are still highly contaminated with radioactivity. They're not areas that you would want people moving in and out of on a regular basis. So actually we need to work out how we manage that long term.
And just finally, you're concerned about the wildlife. Has it been damaged by what's gone on in the last few days?
One would hope that there hasn't been a significant impact on the amazing diversity of wildlife that we now see in the zone. You know, we see bear, bison, Przewalski's horse, we see lynx, all sorts of different wildlife commonly encountered. We've been studying the wildlife for a long time. Hopefully at some point in the future, we'll be able to get back in and see how things have changed.
Well, very interesting. And of course, it's extraordinary, Professor, to think this happened in April 1986. And here we are,
Exactly.
How many years later, 40 odd years later, and we're still talking about the damage it can do to the environment. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Professor Mike Wood, who's from the University of Salford, who's the chair in applied ecology at the University of Salford.